Welcome to Supply Chain Talks. My name is Kristian Mortensen. I'm a Senior Director, Global Partnership and Alliances at project44, and today I'm also your host for Supply Chain Talks. project44 has hand-curated a strong partnership network in order to extend and enable the best possible customer experience. During spring and early summer, we welcome you to our partner series, Supply Chain Talks. These conversations touch on current developments in global supply chains and the world of logistics. Today, we warmly welcome Mr. Dominic Regan to Supply Chain Talks. Dominic is a Senior Director, EMEA Logistics Applications at Oracle. And Dominic, I'm very happy to have you join.
It's a pleasure to be here, Kristian. Thank you very much for inviting me.
My pleasure. Dominic, the TMS market continued to grow globally despite the current economic crisis caused by COVID pandemic. Transportation has become an even more essential part of the supply chain, increasing the need for technology. And recently, the 2021 Gartner Magic Quadrant for Transportation Management Systems was published, with Oracle, just like in the last 14 years, again placing as a leader. Congratulations, and please share, what are you and your colleagues doing right?
It's a very good question, Kristian. I think, first of all, in terms of what we're doing right, it's clearly that we're delivering a solution that brings value to customers. That has been our goal really since we started the product, started the company that Oracle acquired way back in 1999. I think also the position on the Gartner Magic Quadrant speaks to really the if you like, our ability to build a leading solution. And that, of course, is down to the development people that we have, the strategy people that we have who are looking at the market, understanding what the market needs, but also from the customers that we work with. We're very fortunate that those customers cover multiple industries, multiple geographies, multiple different types of processes. And it's bringing all of that business information, if you like, into product management and letting us then take that, developing it, and being able to bring, say, a standardized cloud solution to the market. I think tied to that, of course, is the ability to execute. So say not just having a really good product and having a good vision and being able to innovate, but also being able to deliver value to customers. Such that they're happy to talk about it, to other customers, of course, to the analysts as well.
Dominic, you work with both, let's say, existing and potential customers in determining the business value and return on investments from deploying such solution as OTM. Mm-hmm. What are perhaps let's say, the 3 or 5 business problems your customers want to solve?
Yeah. Again, I've been fortunate enough to work in the transportation space for the last 20 years. Prior to that, I spent 15 years in the warehousing software market. And I mentioned that because to me, it's sort of fundamental in the view that companies have. So normally if you drive along the motorway, you look alongside their warehouses there. Customers who build a warehouse, they recognize that they need a solution to run it, certainly a warehouse of any size. So they'll build a shed and they'll put a system in there. Transportation is a bit different. In many cases, we're working with customers who I always say, they run their transportation based on spreadsheets and speed dial. So from a maturity perspective, they haven't perhaps applied the same level of technology, the same level of system control to transportation that they had with warehousing. And that's important because you say, the 3 or 5 main reasons why companies use a TMS. The first one is because many of them don't have perhaps the control over transportation that they do have for other parts of their supply chain. Fundamental to that control is the second thing, which is visibility. And that clearly that applies to visibility of where are my orders, where are my shipments, the area that Oracle and project44 work very closely on. But it's also about the visibility from a financial point of view. Where am I spending my money on transportation? Who am I spending it with? Could I be spending it more effectively? And then also what I would call sort of informational visibility. So what I'm doing in transportation, perhaps getting the update that the truck has arrived at the destination, I've delivered on time, taking that information and applying it elsewhere within their business. perhaps back to areas like the sort of customer relationship management. So control and visibility are very important. I mean, clearly part of that is about optimizing, making sure you're doing things in the most effective way, from planning how you might fill a container or a trailer, through to how you might plan something that perhaps you're importing from China or Africa. So the planning and optimization has to cover quite a variety of areas. And then I would also say probably the area that we're seeing a lot of interest in at the moment is around sustainability. Certainly a lot of the customers that we work with, if you go to their websites, if you go to the corporate social responsibility area, you can see that both measuring and managing the carbon footprint within their supply chain is important. And of course, for many companies, transportation is a big part of that carbon footprint. So we see a lot of companies who, yes, they want to improve customer service, and yes, they want to manage the costs of transportation, but they also want to do it in a sustainable way. And I'd say, if you took those reasons, they probably represent, 80 to 90% of the reasons why companies come to us and talk about transportation as an area they want to focus on.
You actually mentioned your experience, which before we talked, I really looked into your experience, to your resume and others, and it's really impressive and extensive. And your experience even include Oracle's acquisition of G-Log back in 2005. And if you look at that 15 plus or 20 plus years in the supply chain world, what has changed and what has not changed?
Oh. Yeah, that's a very good question. As you say, I mean, I've been in the transportation software area now for close on 30 years, which is quite frightening, really, when you think about it in that way. But why I think I've sort of been in this area, and one of the things that hasn't changed, it's an incredibly exciting area to work in. Again, people from outside the business might not think that. They see transportation and warehousing as, I always call it, the sort of very mucky end of supply chain. It's the area where you have grease under your fingernails and you smell a bit of diesel. And so people don't look at that as perhaps being terribly glamorous. But the reality is it's logistics that makes things happen. And I say, if I look over the last 30 years, I've been fortunate to work with some very large companies and sort of companies in the small and mid-sized market as well, across all different industries and all different geographies. And what makes it interesting and exciting is that they're constantly coming up with new challenges, constantly looking at ways for finding value. And I say that to me is something that, it really hasn't changed much over the time. The nature of what they're looking at might be a bit different than it was perhaps 15, 20, 25 years ago. But the fact that they're still looking in this area to generate value, that's something that remains unchanged. The other thing that I would say, what has changed and what hasn't changed, you could almost give the same answer: visibility. I mean, if I look when I started in the transportation space, which was in 2001, any conference I went to, they talked about visibility. Visibility was going to be the panacea to all the problems of supply chain. If I look at, today and the conferences that I attend, which of course are mostly online, people are still looking for visibility. It's still very much front of mind with, with many of the customers we work with. But the nature of that visibility has changed. So if I went back 20 years, it was enough to know, a truck had left, it was en route, it had arrived. That was sort of, filling the detail in an area that we really had little control over. These days, of course, it's about looking at visibility in terms of real-time location. And it's about being able to take that data and do things like predict a more accurate time of arrival. In many cases with the customers we work with, it's not just tracking the vehicle or the trailer, it's tracking the freight on there as well. Perhaps the temperature or the temperature outside, and does that influence your choice of equipment? So I say some things have changed, some things have stayed the same, sometimes it's the same thing that has changed and stayed the same. But I say it's still a very exciting area to work in.
I very much agree with you that it's exciting, and in a way, when you look at that journey of visibility, some perhaps 25 years ago, a truck driver would go into a petrol station, send a fax back to the headquarters to say, I'm at this petrol station, And then, you know, in a few hours, he'll get a new fax and telling him where to go. And boy, what a long journey we have had with that kind of visibility.
Yep.
You also mentioned that you're working with some big companies, and Oracle is really known as a supply chain innovation partner for some of the world's most advanced companies. Could you share some concept of some of those projects that you work on?
Yeah, let me try and do that. And I'll choose perhaps a couple of examples from quite different industries. The first one that I'd talk about would be Tetra Pak. And we were fortunate, we ran a webinar with Tetra Pak at the end of last year about their project. And again, that's a project that is all around visibility. And I think it's a really good example of a company that is looking to get the benefits of visibility, but both in terms of course of understanding where, you know, orders and shipments are, but also taking that data and then using it to drive more value in the business. So they have a project that's built around control towers. And of course, fundamental to that is you know, visibility and knowing where things are, but then being able to take that visibility data and to be able to look at it to drive more efficient processes, to be, you know, in some cases looking sort of standardized processes, but then also to be able to use it for doing things like evaluating, say, the sustainability of transport, say, making it more effective, making it more efficient. And I say, I think, you know, say to me, that's a good example of a customer who's, you know, taking that strategic view of their transportation and how it can add value to the business. But on the other side, I'd probably maybe talk about a customer like DP World. And again, I was very fortunate to spend some time with them on our recent virtual summit. So I was able to talk to them about their project. And of course, you know, they're a big logistics company. So they're looking at things from a different perspective, you know, the requirement to service customers, and of course, customers who are increasingly demanding, you know, in terms of what they're looking at from their partners. And so with a company like DP World, it's about speed to market. It's about scalability. It's about being able to have a solution that's sort of standardized across, you know, right across their business. And I say for me, those two sort of customers give a good example of, I say, of how companies are looking much more strategically at the transportation and logistics part of their business, say, not just to control cost, not just to gain visibility, but really to deliver competitive advantage as well. And that, I think, is, as I say, something that we're seeing increasingly. As I said before, you know, in the past, it was perhaps an area that didn't get the attention it deserved. Now, I think, you know, because of the circumstances that we've seen around the world, you know, having visibility is seen as absolutely key to running an efficient business.
Sort of like leading towards the end of our conversation, if you think about it now, and you mentioned like that in the beginning that, you know, supply chain and logistics was never really popular. It's not the one where you go to a cocktail party, people are come and go like, look, he's working in supply chain. Wow, it's exciting. But now it is. And you can just when global supply chains were recovering from the impact of the global pandemic, then it took another setback with the grounding of a megaship in the Suez Canal. And the blockage of traffic through the Suez Canal by the Ever Given really showed once more how fragile global supply chains are. How do you see events like this impact the company's plan regarding investments into technology and modernizing the operations?
Oh, yeah, again, very, very good question. And perhaps if I just start, I mean, really, the impact of the pandemic was brought home to me. I live in a small village in the UK. About 5 miles away, there's a town, and there they have a flour mill. It's been running for 125 years, a company called Wessex Mill. And they run that. And again, if you think back to the pandemic, the beginning of that last year, their whole business changed. They typically produced, they milled flour and delivered it to business customers. And then they were fielding about 600 calls a day from consumers who wanted flour because everyone was suddenly decided they were going to bake at home. And of course, when you're used to producing 35 kilo sacks of flour, then to have to turn around and deliver 1 kilo sacks of flour to consumers is quite a different business. And so they ended up having to put on shifts in the afternoon, shifts in the evening, running 24 hours a day, 7 days a week for the first time in their history. And what really struck me about this is I didn't read about it in my local newspaper. It was in the New York Times, it was on the BBC website, and it was in the Independent newspaper. So again, that to me, absolutely to your point of, supply chains were, as you say, they weren't the most exciting area of discussion. Suddenly, for reasons that we're all familiar with, it's really been brought to the front of mind. Front of mind for consumers who were faced with empty shelves, when they went to supermarkets. But also, of course, front of mind for many companies who suddenly realized perhaps they couldn't get the product that they needed, or they had to switch production entirely. Now, you ask about the sort of impact of that. I think, one of the things is, having exposed how vulnerable many supply chains are, then going forwards, resilience has become very important. It's probably a term associated with supply chains that, we're hearing much more now. Not that, again, to your point, disruption is anything new. We had, the Icelandic volcano, we had the Japanese earthquake and tsunami. We've had cyber attacks on most of the large container lines. Then we had the pandemic, of course, we've had Ever Given, and we've had the fire at the chip provider into the automotive sector. So disruption is a constant. And why that's important, I think, again, is because what companies realized is that they didn't necessarily have the visibility into their supply chains that they really needed. So again, I think, one of the real focus areas going forwards, as well as resilience, will be that focus on visibility. Visibility in terms of where my inventory, whether it's in transit or at rest, but also visibility just in terms of understanding what makes up my supply chain. Who are the partners that I work with? How can I be agile going forwards? And then the last thing, I think, as companies have grasped this opportunity, perhaps to, in the term that's common now, to build back better when it comes to their supply chain, then I think, again, sustainability will become increasingly important. And certainly that's a demand I've noticed from customers in the market. As they're looking to revamp their supply chains, get them set up for the future, to be agile, to be visible, they also want to make sure they're sustainable. And that's something that we've certainly taken on board, is very important for us as Oracle as a provider.
And that will lead me to my to my last question. If you touch on this sustainability, how do you see that technology can highlight sustainability or enable sustainability? One of the most obvious things, of course, being, let's say, reducing empty kilometers for the trucking industry. Probably in Europe, at least 20, but maybe even 30% of trucks driving empty. Only technology can solve that problem. But what are perhaps any other areas where technology can impact sustainability?
Yeah, and again, I think, you bring up a very important point there. Efficient logistics is green logistics. I say you want to minimize the miles traveled, minimize the fuel that's used. You clearly want to sort of maximize utilization. And from a transportation planning point of view, that's something that, again, people will use a TMS such as ours for. And I say we've worked with companies over the years who have really used a TMS to drive that efficiency, to reduce wasted miles. Of course, most companies are doing that within, if you like, the confines of their own supply chain. So it's that part of the supply chain that's under their direct control. But when you've maximized that utilization, then you need, if you still have available space, you need to try and fill it. And so that's where we're seeing interest in, for example, things like load boards and being able to interact with those to make both capacity and freight much more visible. So you can do a better matching job. Perhaps if you've built 75% of a full truck, you want to fill that 25%, because then 25% of that load and that carbon footprint is allocated to to somebody else rather than to your own supply chain. So again, that's about having again, an openness from a system point of view and visibility to be able to bring in demand, bring in capacity, and use that as part of things like planning. I also think from a sustainability point of view, we're seeing the move to looking beyond just one supply chain, looking into multiple tiers of the supply chain. So looking back to your supplier and your supplier's supplier, going back several tiers. And that's important from a sustainability point of view, particularly if you want to measure, carbon footprint all the way through from extraction or manufacture through to consumption and through to renewal. But also important in terms of things like the ethical supply chain. So making sure, you can tell where you sourced components or ingredients from. And I think, that level of visibility is important to many companies, because clearly there can be challenges around sort of reputation if you're, found to have used the wrong supplier or the wrong manufacturing plant or the wrong ingredient, but also important to consumers. And to say one thing about the supply chain, it has become increasingly consumer centric. So any consumer these days can go into a supermarket, take an item off the shelf, scan it, and they can see, exactly the carbon footprint of that product. And they can also understand where everything was sourced from that went in to make up that product. And for me, that sort of demand from the consumer for that type of transparency is impacting all the way through the supply chain.
Yeah, we all learn about these things every day. Just recently, when the shops opened, my daughter went for let's say second-hand shop to buy some jeans, and I go like, so you can get the jeans cheaper. She goes, no, it's about the environment, so they don't waste things. So the young people, they're really teaching us. Mm-hmm. Dominic, thank you so much for this conversation. Thank you for joining Supply Chain Talks, but also thank you for the partnership and the friendship. It's really a pleasure to talk to you, not just today, but to work with you on a continued basis.
Thank you, Kristian. So it really has been a very enjoyable and also very productive partnership. We really appreciate working with project44, and I look forward to the opportunity to work together again. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you, and see all of you next week.